Hi everybody, thank you for joining me. A while ago I did a Paul McCartney Ultimate Album Ranking series where I looked at all of his albums from 1970s McCartney right through to 2020s McCartney 3, and I ranked them in terms of the order of how much I enjoyed them, not how much it was an artistic statement or what I think was the greatest, but just purely down to my enjoyment of the albums. And I put a little message out asking people if they'd be interested in me extending this to John, George, Ringo and the Beatles, and then even bringing them all together into one massive Beatles and solo album ranking video. So that's what I'm starting to do today. I'm going to kick off with John Lennon. So during this video I will be showing the Paul McCartney album rankings as I smash the John Lennon rankings into that. So if you want to see those Paul McCartney videos first, if you've not seen them, then there'll be links down in the description, at the end of the video, etc. You can do that, but I've got here 12 John Lennon albums that I'm going to rank in terms of my order of enjoyment and combine them with the Paul McCartney list. Why 12? Well, I've tried to stick to albums that John Lennon specifically released. I have included Milk and Honey because it was the basis of an album that he almost certainly would have released next had he got the opportunity to do so. So I've included Milk and Honey in this. I'm going to start first of all by looking at the 4 albums that John brought out before his solo career proper started with Plastic Ono Band. Once we've looked at these 4, I'm then going to go to Milk and Honey and work my way backwards chronologically, slotting these albums into the list where I think they go for me. Your list would almost certainly be different to mine, maybe very different to mine, so please let me know down in the comments what would your John Lennon album rankings be in terms of your enjoyment of the albums. But first of all, the first thing that John released outside of the Beatles was the Unfinished Music #1, Two Virgins, the John and Yoko album with its handy sleeve protecting our decency. What can I say about this album that isn't too harsh? Well, to me it sounds a bit like sort of half an hour of The Clangers. If any of you are familiar with The Clangers, old animation series from, when was it from? About 50 years ago. It sounds like backing music to The Clangers to me, with the odd little bits of Mellotron thrown in. It is hard work. It makes Electronic Sound by George Harrison sound like Jerry and the Pacemakers by comparison. It is not an album that I am likely to ever put on and sit and listen to for enjoyment. I could with Electronic Sound, but more on that when we come to George in a future video. So there's our sort of starting point, Two Virgins, and we will see how other albums slot in around that as we go along. So the next album that John and Yoko released was Unfinished Music #2, Life with the Lions. Now, there's a little bit more to cling on to here with this album. There's a track called Song for John on here, which is bordering on an actual proper song. It's by Yoko, and it contains actual music. Very much a sort of Dear Prudence style chord structure to that. So on the basis that there is something on here resembling an actual proper song, I would have to rate this for enjoyment above Two Virgins. And currently, this is in first place. Can it hang on to top spot? What do you think? Well, anyway, next of all came the Wedding album. John and Yoko's sort of gift to the world, if you like. Although I'm sure it was priced at the standard retail rate at the time, documenting their wedding and the Amsterdam bedding afterwards. You'll remember in the Ballad of John and Yoko where there's the line about drove from Paris to the Amsterdam Hilton. Well, you've got on here a lot of Amsterdam Hilton interviews. So, although it's not strictly music as such, there's little bits here and there earlier on, but because this is the Wedding album and it's got interviews with still Beatle John Lennon, even though it's around about that time he said he wanted a divorce from the band, it does make it, I think, more of an enjoyable listen, even though it's not strictly music, than the other two that went before it. So the Wedding album is currently in top spot. There was one more album before John released Plastic Ono Band, and that was Live Peace in Toronto 1969. So there'd been a kind of a rock and roll revival concert in Toronto then, and John and Yoko appeared with Eric Clapton, with Klaus Voormann and with Alan White on drums, and the resulting album of sort of roughly half a dozen songs is pretty enjoyable. You know, we don't have much access to John Lennon live music, so any that we can take is an actual bonus. It's got Cold Turkey on there, which is obviously the new song at the time. Give Peace a Chance is on there, and you've even got an actual Lennon and McCartney original Beatles song in there, in Yeah Blues. So that is, it's actual music, it's a concert, it has to rank above the others for enjoyment. I do quite enjoy listening to this, to be honest. It's a pretty decent album, and it's a good document of that sort of autumn of 1969 period, which is always sort of going to be very interesting to Beatles fans. So Life, Peace in Toronto is going to number 1. I wanted to get those out of the way first, really, and sort of have those as a benchmark. And now I want to sort of cover the proper albums, and I'm going to go in reverse chronological order, like I did with McCartney. So let's get those out of the way. I said I was including Milk and Honey because, although obviously this came out several years after John passed away, the majority of it forms the basis of what would likely have been John's next album. So I wanted to include this. I didn't feel right leaving it out. I find this a very enjoyable album, to be honest. It's kind of alternate John and Yoko mostly through, and I enjoy the Yoko stuff on here as well. Oh Sanity is very short, but it's a fun little tune. Some great John Lennon songs on here. I'm Stepping Out, I Don't Want to Face It, Nobody Told Me. Nobody Told Me is one of those that would have been great on Double Fantasy. Wasn't ready for that, but it would have been an absolutely great song on there. Borrowed Time is a song that it's one of my big sort of ear jams at the moment of songs that I'm hitting regularly. I've kind of rediscovered Borrowed Time since I bought the vinyl just a few weeks ago, and that song sort of really hit me, so I've been enjoying that a lot lately. Grow Old With Me obviously is it's one of those that's kind of difficult to listen to because you know what happened not long after we recorded it, but it was a beautiful song, and it's very much a home demo. Would we have got a proper full clean studio recording of it? Probably. It would have been a shame if John had bypassed that, and that would have been great, but I'm really glad that we've got this home demo. It sounds maybe more heartfelt for being something that John was recording at home. But I find this to be a very enjoyable album. Probably no surprise that at the moment Milk and Honey is taking top spot in my chart. We then move back to 1980, Double Fantasy, obviously the last album that John released, tragically. And what a great comeback it was. John had obviously had several years off at this point, and he came back feeling enthused, revitalised, energised, whatever word you want to use, and it shows in this music. From the start, the ting ting on Just Like Starting Over, which contrasts very obviously with 10 years earlier when he started his solo career properly with Plastic Ono Band, and at the start of Mother with the bong, the sort of deathly bells, and he's got these nice little dings at the start. As a wonderful contrast, it shows that John was probably really optimistic about what the future was going to bring, but again that makes you really sort of sad for what happened just after this. It's got great John songs. Again, it's kind of alternate John and Yoko mainly. The Yoko songs on here are interesting as well. Kiss Kiss Kiss, Yes I'm Your Angel, for example, are really good songs, I think. But Just Like Starting Over is a classic. John's kind of in Elvis mode, isn't he, and delivering probably his best pop tune for years. I say for years, he'd not done much in the preceding years, but it's still probably, if there hadn't have been that big gap, it was still one of his best pop tunes that he delivered in a long time. Clean Up Time, great. He's obviously singing as John does about his own life, and singing about how he'd kind of cleaned himself up and was enjoying life later on. Beautiful Boy Darling Boy, his ode to Sean, an absolutely beautiful song, and Paul McCartney often says that it's one of his favourite John Lennon songs, and you can see why. It's absolutely gorgeous. Watching the Wheels is kind of Imagine 9 years later in terms of the piano anyway. It's a very similar piano structure at the start, but again a great pop song from John there. Woman, the classics keep coming on this song. Absolutely fantastic song, Woman, another love song for Yoko there. And Dear Yoko, similar to sort of Oh Yoko from several years earlier on Imagine, but a more kind of 80s vibe to it, and a really good song towards the back end of the album. So really enjoyable album this, and as much as I enjoy Milk and Honey, I think Double Fantasy does have the edge over it, and that goes into top spot at the moment. Moving backwards in time from Double Fantasy, the previous album to be released was Rock and Roll, John's covers album. It wasn't necessarily the album that was recorded previously, because sessions took place either side of Walls and Bridges, and this, to be honest, is an album that I think the story of this album is more interesting to me than listening to the album. I think it's a very interesting story around this, the fact that John had been sued for lyrics in Come Together, which had been taken from a Chuck Berry song, You Can't Catch Me. That had gone to court, and an agreement was made that John would record an album that contained several songs by the same publisher in order to generate their money, basically, and You Can't Catch Me, of course, turns up as one of the songs on here. So I enjoy the version of Stand By Me that's on here. That's kind of become a bit of a Lennon classic in its own right. Overall, though, I'm not a massive fan of this album. Like I say, I prefer the story behind the album, the sessions with Phil Spector taking place before and after Walls and Bridges, and the story of how it came to be in the first place. So I don't find it the most enjoyable to listen to, but I'm still going to have a good time with it. But I've ranked this currently in 4th place, just above the Wedding album and behind Life Peace in Toronto. The previous album to be released was Walls and Bridges. I find this to be a superb album from start to finish, right from Going Down on Love right through to the end. Ya Ya obviously at the end is a little throwaway, but the last main song on the album, Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out, from start to finish, it's superb. We've got Whatever Gets You Through the Night on there, one of the most important songs of John's career, certainly of his solo career, in terms of the story of how he recorded it with Elton John. Elton said, if it gets to number 1, I want you to come on stage with me and perform this. John said, yeah, okay. And then it got to number 1. So John went on stage at Madison Square Garden. He'd been separated from Yoko for quite a while. She was there in the audience that night, and they got back together that night. So in terms of influence on John's life, an absolutely massive song. But it's just packed with class all the way through. Old Dirt Road, What You Got is one of my favourite John Lennon solo rockers, bar none. Bless You, Scared, Number 9 Dream, Surprise Surprise, Sweet Bird of Paradox, Steel and Glass, Beef Jerky, Nobody Loves When You're Down and Out, all great songs. So it's going to come as no surprise that in terms of enjoyment, this absolutely sails to number 1 at the moment. We then go back to Mind Games. Interesting album. I find this a little bit up and down. The ups are superb, but there's a few songs that have never really grabbed me. Mind Games is obviously one of John's classics. Maybe for me, does it go on a little bit longer than it needs to do? Maybe, but you know, I'm not going to criticise John Lennon. He's John Lennon and I'm frankly not. So I'm not going to criticise him for that. Taitar's nice little rocker. Bring On the Lucy, Free the People, one of my favourite John Lennon songs in terms of his solo career. I just think that is a fantastic song and always guaranteed to be enjoyed by me. Now, I say recently, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, bought this version of Mind Games. This was the remix from, I think it was 2002, completely remixed, and it makes a massive difference. I find this version of the album much more enjoyable, and the one song that really stood out for me on this remix that had never quite sunk into my brain properly on other versions I'd had is I Know I Know. I absolutely love that song now, but it had kind of passed me by a little. This remix brought that out for me. So the highs on this album I really, really love. There's other things that don't grab me quite as much, but maybe they will. Maybe they will at some point. But at the moment, I'm putting Mind Games in 4th place, just behind Milk and Honey. Moving back to 1972, Sometime in New York City. The much maligned by many Sometime in New York City, but not by me. I have said for several years now that I really enjoy this album. It's obviously very political, but beyond that, I find a lot of fun to be had here. I'm particularly interested in the fact that this album was recorded kind of just after I was born. So this to me is almost like a document of where the world was at when I came into it. So I find it interesting for that reason. John Sinclair is a song. It was one of the first John Lennon songs that I got to know. I had the amazingly titled Lennon 4 CD set that came out in 1990. That was kind of my introduction to John Lennon solo. And John Sinclair was a song that really sort of got in my brain quite a lot when I was listening to that. So that's always been a kind of a favourite of mine. I understand how some people would find it very annoying, gotta, etc. I can understand that, but I've always been pretty cool with it. Attica State is a good rocker. New York City is a good rocker. Very much feels like the ballad of John and Yoko, but sort of, 3 years later. Sunday Bloody Sunday is a good interplay between John and Yoko there. And one of my favourite songs on the album is right at the end, Yoko's We're All Water. It's just so much fun. It's crazy. It's Yoko going off on one, but it's so much fun and I really enjoy it. So I do enjoy this album. Where have I put it in my list of enjoyment? Well, at the moment, it's going into third place, behind Double Fantasy, but just above Milk and Honey. We have 2 albums to go. You know which 2 they are. Imagine, first of all, 1971, and it's a classic. Now, what I will say is that I did a John Lennon album ranking video a couple of years ago, and I put this as number 1. Now, here I'm looking at it slightly differently. There will be differences here between that, because here I'm looking at how much do I enjoy the album, and that doesn't always correlate with which you think is necessarily the best. So it came number 1 in there. We will see how it fares here. But I think this is just John's... I do think it's still John's greatest album. Imagine, some people are not going to like the sentimentality of it and maybe some of the lyrics. I think it's a fantastic song. And there is no slack for me on this album at all. It's Crippled Inside, I think, with the new remix, really gave that a new life. The remix that came out in 2018. I thought that lifted Crippled Inside to me to something that it hadn't quite been before. Jealous Guy, obviously really classic, dates back to the Beatles in India days in 1968, Rishikesh. It had sort of other titles and meanings throughout, but eventually was used to great effect here as Jealous Guy. It's So Hard might possibly be the weakest song on the album for me, maybe, but still, if that's the weakest song on the album ain't doing bad. I Don't Want to Be a Soldier Mama, I Don't Want to Die is a song that, again, the remix lifted for me. It just made it something that it hadn't been for me before. And then we go into the last few songs, and it's just absolute bangers all the way. Give Me Some Truth, brilliant, which we've kind of seen with Get Back, was something that the Beatles were working on. John was working on this with Paul, which was really interesting to see. Oh My Love, beautiful song. How Do You Sleep? Okay, it's difficult. I don't find it an easy listen because of the subject matter. If the subject matter was something completely different with that tune and that musicianship that had been played, it would be a great funky song. It's really funky, but it does make it a little difficult. For those of us that are big Paul McCartney fans, it doesn't sit easy with us listening to that song. And How and Oh Yoko at the end, 2 great songs. Oh Yoko is just joy, an absolutely joyous song from start to finish. And I really love the way that the titles at the end almost sort of spell out a minimalistic sentence. Oh my love, how do you sleep? How? Oh Yoko. It's almost like it's been pared down to the minimum number of words, but it sounds like a sentence in its own right. It's a fantastic album, it's a classic, you don't need me to tell you that, but I have done anyway, and at the moment it is going straight up to the number 1 spot. And that just leaves one. Plastic Ono Band, John's first proper solo album release. And it's an astonishing album, the way that John just lays his soul absolutely bare for the world to see is incredible. Right from the start, right from Mother, lamenting the fact that Mother, you had me, but I never had you. Father, you left me, but I never left you. It's heart-wrenching. If this was a book, what a book it would be, this album. Hold On is just a beautiful little song. The Cookie scared me to death the first time I ever heard it. I was in a car on my own late at night, listening to the song for the first time. Nearly crashed the car, to be honest. The remix is interesting because you can hear much more clearly now the fact that it's a double cookie. It's cookie, cookie. You can just hear it on the original, but I can hear it more now, knowing that it's there from the remix. I found out a really good rocker, working class hero. That always sort of sends me back to the fact that my mum had the Imagine single that had Working Class Hero on the other side, and she never liked me listening to Working Class Hero because of the swearing on the other side. But Mum, it's your record. What can I do? You know, I'm only playing your record here. So I've always got fond memories of that, and it is a great song. It's great songs all the way through. Well, Well, Well is probably not top tier on this album for me. Same with Look at Me. That if there's a bit of the album that just isn't quite at the level of the others, it would be Well, 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 Look at Me. But then you've got God, and it's just one of the most stunning things I think that John ever did. Absolutely phenomenal, gobsmacking. When he just sings that he doesn't believe in Beatles and it stops. I just believe in me, Yoko Me. It's just incredible. One of his absolute best songs that he ever did, and I'm including the Beatles in that. So, Plastic Ono Band, I'm looking at this in terms of enjoyment. How much do I enjoy the album? Well, this album is astonishing. It's kind of breathtaking. It stops you in your tracks. Enjoyment is difficult sometimes because of how exposed it is and how much John's laying bare. So I kind of have to reflect that a little bit, and I am putting Plastic Ono Band in second place in terms of enjoyment. In many ways it's better than Imagine, but Imagine just edges it for me, and on enjoyment certainly Imagine edges it for me. So that is my John Lennon album ranking in terms of enjoyment. Now we're going to smash it into the Paul McCartney list. So this is the point where, if you've not seen my Paul McCartney album rankings where I rank those in terms of enjoyment, it's about to come up on screen. So if you want to see that first, if you haven't done already, then there'll be links at the end and down in the description and comments where you can go and do that. That's your warning. Okay, here goes. I have now smashed the John Lennon list into the Paul McCartney list. I'm going to do the same in future videos with George, Ringo and the Beatles to create a massive list of album rankings for Beatles and solo Beatles. But here we go. We've got 59 albums. Obviously this chart has got far more Paul McCartney albums in than John Lennon albums. That's obviously the way the world has worked over the last few decades. But in 59th place, I've gone with Unfinished Music No. 1, 2 Virgins. I've had to put that down at the bottom. It's just not an album that I can put on and listen to. In fact, John's first 3 albums, his experimental albums, I have to put at the bottom because they are difficult listens. And to be honest, they were never really intended to be anything other than difficult listens, I don't think. So I don't think I'm doing them too much of a disservice, but the bottom 3 places are taken up with Unfinished Music No. 1, No. 2 and The Wedding Album. We've then got the lower end of the Paul McCartney scales with Liverpool Oratorio, and moving up through many of his classical works and one of the Fireman albums, various bits and pieces, until we get to 49th place. I'm putting Rock and Roll and 48th place Rock and Roll, and 47th Live Peace in Toronto 1969. We've then got a load more Paul McCartney albums filling the spots before we get to number 36, which is where I've put Mind Games, just above Paul McCartney's New and just below his second Fireman album, Rushes, which I do find to be quite an enjoyable album to listen to, as I discussed in the McCartney album rankings. Again, we've got several more Paul McCartney albums because there's just so many of them before we reach the next John Lennon album, which is in 25th place, Milk and Honey. But that does well to beat off the likes of Electric Arguments, Pipes of Peace, Twin Freaks, Run Devil Run, Back in the World, Wings Over Europe. Really enjoyable albums, but Milk and Honey comes in for me above those. We've got a few more sort of what I would class as mid-tier McCartney albums. before John beats those in 21st place with Sometime in New York City, which I think for me is beating quite a few fairly big hitters there. We've then got a few more Paul albums. We're moving into the top 20 now. These are the big hitters in terms of my John and Paul albums. Before we get number 16, Double Fantasy. That's where I've put John's final studio album that he released in his lifetime, just above McCartney 2. So you can see actually that I've just noticed that's a double header for 1980 there, with McCartney 2 and Double Fantasy there next to each other. Hadn't spotted that before. We've then got what I regard as sort of the higher tier McCartney albums, several of those. Before we get to number 9, Walls and Bridges, which has done very well for me to beat the likes of Venus and Mars, Wildlife, Egypt Station, Red Rose Speedway, which are really enjoyable albums for me, but I'm putting Walls and Bridges ahead of those, and it's inside the top 10. We're then really getting top tier albums now. Tug of War, Wings Over America, Flaming Pie, McCartney starts us off with the top 5. We've got 2 John Lennon albums to go. At number 4, Plastic Ono Band. I and ahed about whether to put Plastic Ono Band above or below Band on the Run, but Band on the Run just beats it. And I think probably because I'm talking here about enjoyment, Band on the Run is designed more as entertainment, I think, than Plastic Ono Band would be. But Plastic Ono Band gets the big points just for being so astonishing. We're then into the top 2. Now, you already know that we've got Imagine left. So where is it going to be? Is it going to be number 1 or number 2? Let's have a look. It's in number 2. I've put it ahead of Band on the Run, but just below Ram. In terms of John and Paul solo albums, for me, Ram is still the most enjoyable one, but Imagine, it's not far off. I really had to think about this, but I think it's good to see that in that top 4, it's nice and evenly shared between John and Paul. Not deliberate at all. I've put these things honestly where I think they should be ranked. And what I've done here is I've looked at the Paul and John rankings in this, and I've worked out like an average score, if you like. And we can see that Paul McCartney, his albums on average come out in position 29.5, and John's albums come out in position 31.8. So we've got about I think 59 albums here, so that works out about right. But Paul just beating John there in the average placings. So I hope you enjoyed that. I am going to be back soon with George doing his album rankings in terms of my enjoyment, and then I'll be throwing that into this list and seeing where George can fit in there. I'll be doing the same with Ringo. And then I will be finishing off this series by throwing the Beatles albums in there. It'll be very interesting to see where they end up and how the top tier Beatles solo albums can compare with the Beatles albums. So stay tuned, folks. If that's of interest, make sure you've hit that subscribe button, and then YouTube is much more likely to notify you that I've made those videos. I will be back with those, as well as news of any Beatles related releases that are coming, because they are coming fairly soon. And I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye.